Welcome to Genetics Decoded. I'm Sharon Palmer, your host. Please note that all of the information that we present is just for general information. It is not to be considered medical advice. What we're going to cover today is the MTHFR gene and to some degree its impact around the methylation pathway. What I want to look at is all of the hype around this gene justified, or are we being oversold? Today we're going to have an in-depth look at the MTHFR gene and to some extent the role it plays in the methylation pathway. There's quite a lot of interest in this gene right now. There's some podcasters who are talking about it. They're putting some information on their Instagram feeds. We always know when this happens because we get a flood of inquiries about this gene and around the methylation pathway. What I really want to look at today is all of the hype that's being put around this gene and the methylation pathway, is it justified, or are we being oversold on the impact of this gene? So stay with me today because we're going to go in and have a good look, and we're also going to see some of the other really critical things that we need to be looking at besides the MTHFR gene itself. I pay a lot of attention to what's being written about genetics, what's being posted online about genetics, and what I see is a lot of people are starting to write around the MTHFR gene, and you could pick up 3 or 4 articles and they're all going to say slightly different things. Some people get it right, some people get it partially right, and some people get it completely wrong. So what I want to start with today is clarifying what is the MTHFR gene and what does it do in the body. So the first thing is that we all have something called the MTHFR gene. It is called the methyl tetrahydrofolate gene. So you can see why we use an abbreviation. There's also some other awful abbreviations being used for this gene out there. I'm not going to use them myself, being a mother, but if any of you have heard it, you'll understand what this gene is being referred to. But anyway, we have the MTHFR gene, and the role of this gene is to produce an enzyme in the body. And the name of that enzyme is called methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase. So again, why we use an abbreviation. And what this enzyme does is it helps you produce something called 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. It is the activated form of folate. In fact, it is the final stage in your folate metabolism. What we're really looking at here is a particular gene producing a particular enzyme, and that enzyme helps us in our folate metabolism. So really quite simple. And every single one of us has this enzyme, but the capacity of this enzyme to work effectively varies from person to person. So some of you out there will have a completely normal function of this enzyme. It will be working really, really well, and you will have no problem in that conversion pathway. Others of you listening will have significant genetic variances in this pathway that will equate into this enzyme not working very effectively. And the impact on this enzyme can vary between 20 to 30% to 70% or more reduced activity. I've done my genetics, so I know for certain that my MTHFR enzyme works at 35% decreased capacity. Now, if you want to know how well this enzyme is working in your body, you need to go in and look at the genetics here. And so this is what, when people are talking about measuring your MTHFR genetic variances, they're talking about going in and looking at your capacity to determine how well this enzyme is working. Now, if we have a look at the MTHFR gene, there is more than 30 variances in this one gene, and not all of them are playing a role in the activity of this enzyme. There are 2 particular variances that we need to look at, and they're referred to as the 677 and the 1298. If you're doing any genetic testing, it's actually really important that you're looking at both of these, not just one or the other. So make sure any genetic testing you're doing is reporting on both. The 677 variant has a much greater impact on reducing the function of this enzyme, but you need to look at them together. And by assessing both, this is where you'll be able to go, there's no risk factors here, the enzyme is working perfectly normal, or do I have some really significant genetic risk factors and my enzyme is working at 70% or reduced capacity? And even if it's working at 35% reduced capacity, there's going to be some clinical implications from that. It's one of these areas that I think is really important. You want to go in and really understand how your MTHFR gene is working. If we look, we know that the equation is quite simple. We have a gene producing an enzyme allowing us to make 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. So what is all the fuss about? It's a very simple pathway, but there's really good reason that we want to understand what's happening with this gene and the capacity of the enzyme, and that's because we're looking at the ability to produce something called 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. This activated form of folate is really important in the body. That's what we're really looking at, is if you can't make enough of this activated form of folate, there's going to be clinical implications and impacts around your health. There's some really good research around the MTHFR genes. I've tried to focus my research around what we call meta-analysis studies. So this is where a researcher looks across a whole range of different researchers, and that way you can come up with more definitive conclusions. If we have a look at what is the impact of having these MTHFR variances and not being able to produce enough 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. So one of the really key areas is around pregnancy and conception. So I've got some information here that we know that women who have these MTHFR variances, that it can be playing a real role around recurrent miscarriages. It can play a role around risk of Down syndrome, and also playing a role around preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy. So there's really good reasons why a woman in preconception care, and even who may already be pregnant, to really understand what's happening with her capacity to produce this 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. You will see in the market now that there's often people like these clinics who are doing IVF, or practitioners who are focusing in on preconception care. They're starting to realise the importance of going in and genetically screening here and then getting the correct intervention. And the research really supports that that's good clinical practice. We know that the research is pointing to MTHFR mutations really impacting around mental health and well-being. We're seeing research that it's tied into risk around depression and schizophrenia. And if we kind of look in the marketplace right now, particularly post-COVID, mental health has a really strong focus. The system is kind of overwhelmed with dealing with people with mental health issues, and it's important to, again, understand the role here around 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. Part of that is that when that 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate is pulled into your methylation pathway, part of that pathway is around another enzyme called COMT. And COMT on its own has really significant impact around mental health. So what we need to understand here is this domino effect, that if you've got variances and you can't produce enough 5-methyl, it's going to impact on your methylation pathway, that could impact on your COMT, and therefore we can see impact around mental health and well-being. We see from a neurological, vascular point of view that the MTHFR variances are playing a role. So around things like migraines. Now, a lot of people are chronic migraine sufferers. They've often tried lots and lots of different interventions to lesser or greater extent. But again, if someone is suffering from migraines, you would want to go in and look at their genetics here. We know that it's playing a role around vascular dementia. And the thing with your 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, when it's being pulled into your methylation pathway, it's really playing a role in your ability to convert your homocysteine into your methionine. Now, homocysteine has a really big impact through the vascular system. If you can't effectively clear your homocysteine, it can build up within the blood and it can start to trigger a lot of inflammation through the vascular system and a lot of vasoconstriction. So again, this is why we see some issues around vascular dementia. But the other thing is too that, if you've got high levels of homocysteine in the blood, it will begin to negate the impact of nitric oxide. And nitric oxide allows your blood vessels to vasodilate. Now, men, you want to pay attention here. Nitric oxide is very important for getting and maintaining an erection. So if up until now you were thinking, I don't care about my FTR gene, well, maybe now you do. Again, you see this domino effect that high homocysteine negates nitric oxide, impacts on the vascular system, which can have impact through the whole body. So this is why we should be very careful as practitioners is in just trying to treat the symptoms. We should always be going back in and looking at these biochemical pathways, this function through the body, because get that whole methylation, get your 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate levels right, and it will have implications through your health in multiple ways, in ways that you might notice and in ways that you might not even be aware of. We can see that these MTHFR risk factors can be playing a role in a number of reproductive cancers in women, so specifically around breast cancer and ovarian cancer. So again, women want to be going in and screening around the genetics here, one, as a preventative, but two, if they've been diagnosed with either of those, to go in and find out whether they can begin to impact around these pathways with very specific supplementation. We see quite a strong risk around MTHFR variances and cardiovascular disease. So we're seeing again this role around hypertension, the high blood pressure. That comes back again to what we were just talking around, homocysteine, around nitric oxide, around vasodilation. So we shouldn't be thinking that if we've got high blood pressure, all we need to do is get onto some blood pressure medication and that will solve the problem. One of the things you want to go in and look at is look at the drivers, look at your ability to vasodilate, and these pathways will be playing a role there. We see an impact around stroke and, of course, around elevated homocysteine. Even though there's this very strong focus around our blood lipids and its impact around cardiovascular disease, I think homocysteine is a really underrated risk factor, is going in and measuring your homocysteine. But don't think that you can just use your homocysteine to determine whether you have these genetic risk factors in MTHFR, because there's multiple drivers of homocysteine. Homocysteine is good to use to track once you know you have these genetic risk factors, but it won't give you the insight that doing the genetic testing will do. One of the really important insights around the MTHFR mutations is really this impact around the methylation pathway. We certainly in future podcasts will be going much more in depth into this, but that pathway in and of itself is very complicated. There are lots and lots of other genes, but knowing that these pathways are connected, if you've got a problem in one area, it can start to have an impact in another key area in the body. body. That's the thing that genetics is really demonstrating, is that we've got to be careful that we're not dividing the body up into sections, that somebody just looks after our cardiovascular health and somebody else looks after our mental health and somebody else deals with us when we're going through a pregnancy, is knowing that there's key functions and pathways that are impacting on all of those systems. What we want to do is look at the function and work from kind of the bottom outwards. When I listen to some of these podcasts or when I read some articles that are written around the MTHFR gene, it really is being presented in the market as this almost playing a role in everything. And I think we've got to be very, very careful around going down this pathway where we put too much hype and too much emphasis on a particular gene. We need to know it, but the main thing is that this gene is playing a role in your folate metabolism. I hear practitioners kind of almost saying to their patient base is that if you've got anything going on with your health, it's because you have an MTHFR mutation. So if you can't lose weight, it's because you have this risk factor. If you've got liver problems, it's because of this risk factor. If you've got mental health problems, it's because of this risk factor. Now, certainly this can play a role, but I think what we need to do is assess the activity of the enzyme and then realise its implications through the rest of the body. At a clinic level, I consider this one of the most important areas to look at. I have it in my top 5 systems that I would assess at a clinical genetic perspective. But I don't ever just look at the MTHFR gene on its own. I look at it within that bigger picture of folate metabolism. Of all the things that I do in clinic, getting this pathway correct, so getting folate metabolism right, getting methylation pathways right, has the biggest impact from a clinical point of view. I've treated thousands of patients over 13 years, so I've been looking at this pathway for a very, very long time. I have patients who will come back to me and say, within 1 to 2 days, I started to notice a difference. Clinically, if I address these pathways, I really do expect within 1 to 2 weeks that people start to report improvements. Where I see the biggest impact is around energy production. And that's because, again, if you're getting the 5-methyl and its impact around homocysteine and also your whole B methylation pathway supported, is that it can have an enormous impact around the production of energy within the mitochondria. If I don't see an improvement in 3 to 4 weeks around energy, I'm always looking at what other genetics may be playing a role here. I also see really significant improvements around mental health and well-being. So people report that their anxiety levels begin to improve, not feeling as depressed. They're more motivated. They've got more clarity, more focus. And all of these things play a really big role in people's day-to-day around the quality of their life. I remember having one patient who came to me with chronic fatigue. She had been struggling for more than 5 years. She spent her days laying on her couch in her lounge room. She lived on this lovely big piece of property. She had this big picture window. She loved gardening, but she said, I just don't have the energy to get out and do any gardening. So I lay on my couch, I look at my garden, I watch it starting to get overgrown, but I can't do anything about it. And I got a message from my receptionist after we started to treat her. It was very, very quickly, within a couple of weeks. And she said, I want you to tell Sharon that I'm out in my garden and I'm chopping down trees. And so this is really, the impact that it can have. I also had another patient who had a particularly good response from a mental health point of view, and she looked at me and she said, I want to know that if you get run over by a bus, can I still get my activated vitamin B supplement? I was like, well, yes, you can. Glad to see that you're concerned about my well-being. But again, once people have tried something and they know that it's working for them, they're very much tied into continuing and supporting that. I also had another patient who had crippling anxiety, who ended up having really a real down regulation of that anxiety, and then she ran out of her supplements, and within 3 days she said she woke up on the third day and thought, there it is again. There's that anxiety, that waking up with that sense of worry and concern. Nothing in particular. It's not like anything changed from day to day or week to week. But again, that impact of not having that 5-methyl. If you're not able to produce some of these activated forms of Bs, not just your 5-methyl, but other ones in other pathways, it can really impact on your day-to-day. When you get it right, it can also you can have a significant improvement. At the clinic, we tend to formulate our own Bs. Now, it's getting easier and easier to address the mutations in the MTHFR. This is really interesting. When I started practicing, I've been using activated Bs in clinic with 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate for over 13 years. And I noticed very quickly it made a very, very big difference. When I started using activated Bs, I could not source 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate within Australia. At that stage, the TGA, which is the Therapeutic Goods Association, had banned the use of 5-methyl. You had to kind of go through all of these convoluted pathways to import it from New Zealand. Now, it's very easy to get 5-methyl within Australia. And so this shows you that as we get more knowledge and we get better understanding, then, associations, systems begin to change. So it's getting much easier to source the activated form, which is the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. As important as it is to look at the MTHFR gene and the activity of the enzyme and its ability to make 5-methyl, it is not the only thing you need to look at. And this is where I want to kind of really caution people into having this myopic focus. So let's say you've gone out and you've done your genetic screening here, and you may have been told that you have no genetic risk factors, that you've got no decreased capacity to produce this 5-methyl. And you may think, great, I don't need to do anything here. Well, that may not be true at all. At the beginning of this podcast, I had mentioned that, this enzyme is doing the final step of your folate metabolism. What you really need to look at are all of the other genes that precede your 5-MTHFR gene. And that's because these other forms of folate are just as important. The impact on our health is just as important. A lot of times what I hear in podcasts and people writing articles is they tell you that the MTHFR enzyme is converting folate into 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. That's not correct. It's actually converting 5,10-methyl tetrahydrofolate into 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. I know it's all a bit of a mouthful. But the thing is, there's about 5 or 6 other steps between folate and what the MTHFR enzyme will convert. If you're not able to make that 5,10-methyl tetrahydrofolate, even if you don't have any genetic risk factors in the MTHFR enzyme, you're still not going to solve your problems. And so if we kind of look at your folate, is you've got your folate and then it goes through this very complicated pathway, and then the final step is the 5-MTHFR enzyme. Now, a lot of people use the different forms of folate interchangeably. They think that folate and folic acid and 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate are kind of all of the same thing, and they're all doing the same job in the body. And that's not correct at all. I want you to kind of think of something called the folate family. if you all look to your own family, so let's say we've got the Smith family, and in the Smith family there's mum and dad, there's brother John and sister Mary, and we know that even though we're within the same family, we have different characteristics. We may do different jobs, and let's say the son is a stockbroker and one day he gets really, really sick. Nobody would ever think to call up his sister, who's the nurse, and say, well, he can't make it today, so come in and do his job. You're in the same family. And vice versa. If the nurse was sick, you wouldn't expect the stockbroker to be able to come in and do the job. You need to see your folate and all of the different forms of folate in this capacity. They are part of the folate family, but they do very, very different things. And your body can't use one form to do the role of another. And so when we're talking about forms of folate, it's really important to understand that they're different, they have different functions, and even the way that they're metabolized through that folate pathway, the way they're transported in the body, the way they're transported into the cell, it all varies. And so the more you understand around the different forms and how they act in the body, the greater your capacity to, at a clinic level, really get things right. Because when you get things right, it can make a really, really big difference. Let's have a look at some of these different forms in the folate pathway, or the folate family. We have something called folate. Folate is your naturally occurring form. It is the form that you're going to find in your food, in your fruits and veggies. So if you go out and eat a spinach salad, you're going to be introducing a whole lot of folate into the body. Then we have something called folic acid. This is the synthetic form. If you're buying vitamins and mineral supplements over the counter, it is pretty likely that they're going to have folic acid in them. Not always. Manufacturers can choose other forms, but the main form of supplementation will be folic acid. It will also be the form that will show up in your food that's been processed and manufactured. So when we see food manufacturers boasting around added vitamins and minerals to make it really healthy, it will usually have folic acid. That will be the form that will be used. And folic acid is also used as a preservative in a lot of our foods. Without us knowing it, a lot of us are getting quite a lot of folic acid in the diet. If you're not eating the right foods, you might not be getting enough folate. But those two things are very, very different. When I look at all the different forms of folate in the folate family, the one I like the least is folic acid. It's the one we should definitely stay away from, but you want to be really careful with the choice of folate that you're taking. Then we have something called folinic acid. Folinic acid is also naturally occurring in some of our food, but there are supplement manufacturers now who go, well, I don't want to use folic acid, I want to use a better form, and they might put folinic acid in. So when you kind of pick up your vitamins and minerals, go and turn it over. Have a look, because I think it's all been so confusing. We just go, oh, it's all the same and it all must be good, because if it wasn't good, we wouldn't be allowed to buy it. And again, that's not true. If you've been taking any vitamin supplements, go and have a look at exactly what form is there. It's more likely to be folic acid, but if you've been working with a practitioner or you've been trying to source activated forms of Bs, you may see different forms listed. Then we have the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate form. So this is the form that we've really been focusing in on. This is the form that people with the MTHFR variant are not good at producing. There are now a lot more supplements that are putting the 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate form in. As a practitioner, that is my go-to. That is the one I'm interested in. I'm not really interested in any of the other forms for a whole range of reasons. But we also know that There's some foods that will contain 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, just like some foods contain folinic acid. So you might be thinking, well, I don't need to take a supplement. If I just choose the right foods, I'll be able to address this. But that's not really the pathway that you want to be going down. The amount of 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate in your foods is very, very small. There's only a certain number of foods that have got it. And this is where I always say, if you've got MTHFR mutations, genetic variances, you really need to be addressing this with the right form of supplementation. You can try and choose some foods and keep them in, but you won't fully address this. So it's very important that you get the right supplement here. And I see a lot of patients who have got their MTHFR genetic information, and I always say to them, what are you doing? And very rarely do I see people who are addressing this pathway correctly. You can get this genetic information, you can find out that this pathway is not working for you, but if you don't get the right intervention, you haven't really achieved much. So I say to people, are you taking the 5-methyl form? And they go, no, I'm on folic acid. And so I go, well, that's not going to help you. It's really important that you understand what the correct interventions are here as well. There are quite a number of people out there these days who are incredibly interested in their health, often come under the term biohackers. And I'm always really impressed with how much research they do, how much they're interested in their health. What I find is they're the exception to the rule. Most people don't have the time or the interest. They simply want to get a little bit of information and they want to be directed. They're just like, don't tell me all the ins and outs, just tell me what I have to do. But what I want you to really understand is that if you don't get your interventions right, you're not going to solve this pathway, and you won't get the outcomes that you're looking for either. What I see with these biohackers is they go, you know what? I'm already on 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate and I've got my activated B2 in, which is my essential cofactor. And I've looked at my MTHFR gene and I know that I can't hand that off, and I know that I can't refresh my vitamin B12, which is all correct. These are all really critical things you can look at. But then I'll often say to them, well, okay, you're taking your 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, but can you absorb it and transport it? Can you actually cross it into the cell? Can you transport it within the cell? And this is where I'll often see like, oh, I didn't know that those things needed to be assessed. And that's what all of those other steps in your folate metabolism will tell you. Can you absorb it? Can you transport it? Can you get it into the cell? We were looking at the role of the MTHFR variances and how they can impact on mental health and well-being, how they can impact on vascular dementia. But I always say, how do you cross your 5-MTH into your neuron? Just taking it, just having it in the blood does not mean that it's in the cell. And I think that's the thing that we've really got to understand, is that just because you swallow something or eat something, even if it may be the exact form, it doesn't mean that it's yet in the cell and active. And that's why you've got to trace all of these steps. We saw how important the MTHFR variant was for pregnant women. We know that the ability, you've got the pregnant mum has to hand that 5-methyl off across the placenta. How do you cross it across the placenta? Well, that's the folate receptor. Now, you need to go in and assess that. The women who have genetic risk factors in their folate receptor tend to have the highest risks of the most severe forms of things like spina bifida and neural tube defects. Even if you're getting the right form in, it doesn't mean it's getting where it needs to be. So this is why you can't just look at the 5-MTHFR. You need to look at the whole pathway. The main thing that we're looking at here is we're not trying to just understand the 5-MTHFR. We are really trying to assess our folate metabolism. It is so critical. That pathway is so critical in the body. Some of those other forms of folate are being pulled into the nucleus of every cell in your body, and within the cell, they're helping you to make your DNA, protect your DNA, and repair your DNA. That is just as important as that 5-methyl form being pulled into the methylation pathway. And you're not going to understand the implications just by looking at the 5-MTHFR gene. What we really want to do is look at folate metabolism. We need to understand how that folate metabolism and the ability to make 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate could impact on the methylation pathway, which is really critical. So just don't think that by looking at the MTHFR gene that you're getting the complete picture. We've got to be careful that we don't think that a piece of the jigsaw puzzle is the complete picture. You've got to understand the kind of the gene-to-gene impact, but you've got to keep pulling your focus out and understanding pathways. Biochemical pathways are where you're going to get the biggest impact. So for anyone who's been listening to this, if you have not done any genetic screening around your MTHFR genes, I think it's a really valuable pathway to go down. But don't just order up your MTHFR genes. And there is the capacity in the marketplace to just go in and order these genes. It is a very ineffective way to look at your health. It costs more to look at these 2 genes on its own than some companies charge to look at multiple panels. But so think about what you're actually looking at. But from a clinical point of view, getting this folate pathway and supporting your methylation pathway is where you can get some of the biggest impact around your health. Thank you so much for listening to Genetics Decoded. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. Tell your friends all about what we're doing, because we truly are individuals. Your genetic data can be used for you to make much better decisions around your diet, supplements, and lifestyle. Join me each week to find out how.